So the talk will be divided into roughly 3 parts. So first of all, I will use a PowerPoint to talk about the Chinese art collection at PAM, vis-a-vis its history and content. And then we'll switch to a show and tell. And I'm very grateful to the staff for indulging me in bring our objects out and be able to do it. As you can see in my background, I'm in the Grace Nicholson room, newly renovated, and that's where we have the objects, and Christina will come in and help me to actually show you some of the things that we have. And then finally, I will save the last 5-10 minutes for any comments and discussion we have.
Ay, ese gatito.
Sorry, Sonia, let me interrupt you. For those that just joined, can you please make sure your microphones are on mute? Thank you. Sonia, I think you can move forward. Thank you.
Okay, so now I'm going to share my PowerPoint. I hope it's visible to everybody.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, and I do need to play. Let me try to launch the PowerPoint. Okay, here we go. Well, my first serious encounter with the Pacific Asia Museum Chinese collection really began in 2014 when USC formed a partnership with the museum and hired Christina Yu as the first director. She mounted an exhibition the same year and called attention to one of the collection's major strengths, contemporary Chinese art. And the exhibition is titled The First Wave, Modern and Contemporary Chinese Paintings in USC Pacific Asia Museum Collection. And on the screen, you see one of the works featured in it. It's a work by Gang Jiangyi as a beauty salon. And it's an oil on canvas painting done in 1985. And another interesting part of that exhibition was the display of a large collection of terracotta figurines, each about 1 foot high. And it's known as the Rent Collection Courtyard. And what we're looking at is a set of study models that artists made during the 1950s. And this set turned out to be a critical launch pad for the Communist Party when the Cultural Revolution began in the late 60s and early 70s. And Jiang Qing, one of Mao's wives, I think number 4, was appointed the head of artistic production during that time. And this set was actually turned into life-size statues and being touted as the representative of the new revolutionary spirit in the fine arts. And so, so Pan actually has to study figures for that set. Now, the two set of objects that I've been showing you alongside many others came from a series of very interesting exhibitions that PAM did in its early years. So the two exhibitions that I highlighted here on the screen respectively took place in '87 and also in '91. And so one is called Beyond the Open Door, Contemporary Paintings from the People's Republic of China. And then '91, I Don't Want to Play Cards with Cezanne. So the two works that I've been showing you came from those. And so the 2014 show brought back some of the highlights from these. And what's so groundbreaking about these early shows on contemporary Chinese arts is the fact that a lot of the household names that we have in the contemporary art scene first show their paintings, their works at PAM. So for example, many of you probably know Wang Guangyi, who's known for his political pop. And in the I Don't Want to Play Cards with Cezanne show, he did, he showed one of his earlier works. It's called Big Dolls, Holy Mother and Child, 1988. And then on your right is a work by Xu Bing, and I believe this is the first work that he showed in the United States. That's long before he became super famous. And using his characteristic nonsensical Chinese characters for his own language, so to speak. And so these shows can really enable these artists to establish a foothold in the United States art scene and launch their careers. And Xu Bing, for example, continued to maintain a fairly good relationship with the Pacific Asia Museum. And so he collaborated with some of the local artists, especially muralists in Los Angeles, to create the work on the screen that they eventually gave to the museum in 2003. And it's featured in a show called Calligraffiti and writing in contemporary Chinese and Latino art. And so you can, for those of you who know a bit about Xu Bing's work, you can see his characteristic calligraphy showed up in this work at the top and the bottom, and also, but it's much larger than some of the things that he had done up to that point, because this is a pretty large size mural, wall painting, so it's, in that sense. Now, looking back at those works and try to situate these exhibitions within a broader context. So as you can see, these were not the first shows being done by the Pacific Asia Museum. And this is pretty well known to everybody in the audience, so I'm not going to repeat it. So the museum was officially founded in 1971. And perhaps it might not come to your mind immediately that it's the same year when the People's Republic of China gained a seat at the United Nations without US opposition. And so that actually paved the way for the visit by President Richard Nixon to China the following year in 1972. So this is a huge moment in US-China relations, because since the end of World War II, especially after the establishment of the People's Republic of China, 49, China was viewed as an enemy with the United States because it's a communist country. And so Nixon's visit really helped normalize the relations and finally led to the exchange of ambassadors in 1979. So if we even put it in a larger historical context, this is actually a very remarkable time because it allowed people from both China and the United States to visit each other and had more meaningful exchanges. So think about the history of collecting Asian art in the earlier century, in the 19th century, early 20th century. We do have quite a lot of Asian objects being brought into the United States, but people were excluded due large part to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which remained in place from 1882 all the way down to 1943. So you have objects, but no people. And so when we look at PAM's history, it's a different episode where there's a normalized relationship between China and the United States. And so that has a huge impact. And what we see in PAM's collection is really a local manifestation of this exchange. So now let's take a closer look at what some of the things that PAM did since the Nixon visit or its founding. So one of the first shows that they did was one actually curated by Chinese officials, and it's called the Hang and Tang murals. And so it's a package show that actually came on a tour through the United States. So PAM was one of the several museums that hosted it. And I will have more to say about that. Now, in terms of the connection to contemporary Chinese art, because this normalized relationship, many members of the PAM Board of Trustees went to China and they started to cultivate relationship with working artists at the time and also started to buy things. And so that actually resulted in a show that happened much later on the painter named Cui Zifan, which took place in 1995. And show you the work. So we actually, I guess it's not brought out. Anyway, so these works were collected by the museum director of the time, David Kaminsky, who was a big fan of Choi. His style reminds me something in between somebody called Wang Tangsuo, who's a really famous literati painter, late 19th, early 20th century, and then also Qi Baishi, who was actually very popular in Beijing at the time. So Choi lived in Beijing, so I think maybe the connection to Qi Baishi was a bit stronger. So we can see in these two works. And so Kaminsky and many other people from PAM started to collect his works and brought them over to the United States. And so that really formed an important part of PAM's Chinese art collection. Now, another important development that took place in those early years in PAM's history was the hiring some local scholars to be adjunct curators. So in 1981, Richard Strasberg at UCLA, professor of Chinese literature at UCLA, was appointed adjunct curator of Chinese art. And so you can see immediately there are quite a number of shows that focus on China or Chinese culture. And so one of the things that he did, one of the very first shows that he did was on the painter Zhang Daiqian. And many of you know that he's one of the best known painters from the 20th century in China, often being compared to Picasso, or he likes to call himself like Picasso of China, whatever. And he in fact visited Picasso in France. So a picture showing the two together on your right. And then the picture on the left shows Zhang, who's actually living in San Francisco in different parts of California toward the end of his life. And the young man sitting next to him is actually his son, Paul, who actually became the trustee of his collection after Zhang's death. So the first director of Pacific Asia Museum, James Carmichael, was really interested in organizing a show on Zhang Daiqian from the beginning. And it took the museum 10 years to actually put it all together. So when the show finally took place, unfortunately, Zhang passed away just a few months earlier. And it really, show you some of the paintings from there. Some of the things that from Paul Chang's collection and also things from the National History Museum in Taipei that they were able to borrow at the time. And eventually, some of the works by Zhang entered into PAM's collection, and we do have a few, and I'm very pleased that I can show you two. So the cinnabar lotus on the far left, and then Gibbons, and so I will show you the actual works after the PowerPoint presentation. And so these are lithographs that Zhang made in two sets for the Editions Press in San Francisco. So he was living there at the time. And Zhang was known as a painter, but he's also interested in experimenting with different new medium. And so lithograph were things that he made, and those were prints, and very high quality prints made from stones. And so we'll take a closer look at these. So as you can see, PAM has a fairly wide-ranging collection of modern and contemporary Chinese art. Now let me return to the first show that PAM hosted, Hang and Tang Murals. So as I mentioned earlier, it was a package show from China, and it's actually very common in the 70s and 80s, shortly after the normalization of relations between China and other countries, that they feature exhibitions that had a lot of recent archaeological discoveries. So during the 50s and 60s, there are a lot of different archaeological discoveries made throughout China, but they were not made known to the outside world until later. And a lot of the reports came out pretty much after the Cultural Revolution. And so, the more stunning discoveries pertain to these murals tombs. And so you can see that they were tombs, imperial tombs built in the early 7th century or from the Tang Dynasty, and they have murals, and they also have all kinds of tomb furnishings. So these tomb figurines are a pretty common object from them. And so I'm showing you on the screen a mural that was exhibited in different cities in the US, and also figurines that kind of look like what you see. And tomb figurines were actually very popular collectors' items, especially in the West, because Asian or Chinese collectors don't like them for its connection to tombs and being inauspicious. But whereas collectors in the West have no qualms about that, and in fact, they like the liveliness associated with these figurines. And some of them do really capture the fashion of the time, and like this example in the Met. And whenever I show this in my classes, and my students love it because it's just really fashion and it's the best. And in the Pacific Asia Museum, we do have quite a number of tomb figurine objects from different times in China's history. So in the new gallery, the Chinese Art Gallery, we'll see this horse on the left, purported from the Han Dynasty, 1st, 2nd century Common Era. And the set on the right, you see a horse and a groom, and that came from also the Tang Dynasty. And I'm also just do a little promotion because I'm co-organizing a exhibition on the Silk Roads at the USC Library that will open in February next year. And we are very happy to be able to borrow this set, the horse groom, and then I will also get to show you in this room a bit later. So, so these are the kind of things that have entered PAM's collection. Now, some of you may be noticing I put a lot of information in my captions for these objects because I'm very interested in telling a collection history through people. And I particularly noted the donors in my captions. And you see that many of these tomb figurines or ceramics in PAM's collection in general came from a number of key individuals. So Robert Stackel, for example, gave over several hundred objects. Many of them are tomb figurines like these. So on the screen, there's another set showing you a couple on horseback, and it's a reflection of the cultural trend of the time that both men and women would ride on horses, because most of the best horses were imported from Central Asia. And so it's really a status symbol. And to make a figurine of these horses and put them in tombs actually raises a lot of questions about their function and meaning at the time. And so, and a lot of them actually made in large quantity. It's not just like one, but in fact in dozens or in hundreds, or even, I think the most elaborate will be in the thousands. And so, so a lot of these things eventually made it into different collections outside China. Now, besides tomb figurines, we also have the more typical type of ceramic wares, like plates and different shapes of containers. So another important part of PAM's Chinese art collection pertained to a large donation made by Jack Lyman, who was actually lived a huge part of his life in Asia. So he was in the US military during World War II, and then he remained in Southeast Asia, different parts of Southeast Asia afterwards, and eventually became, I believe, an ambassador to Malaysia. And so through his long time in Asia, he was able to collect a lot of things, and most specifically, exports to Southeast Asian country from China. So the large plate or charger that you see on the screen dates from the 14th century. And I think the date should be fairly good for a piece like this, because you're talking about very fragile objects that have survived. And blue and green ware from 14th century, relatively in short number. And so Lightman gave quite a number of these to Pam. Now, this is another object, also a blue and white ware, that will be featured in the new gallery. And as you can see, it's a very unusual shape. It's called a double gourd. And on the surfaces throughout this base, there are all kinds of characters, different variations of the same character, soul or longevity. And it's not hard for you to guess that this is probably a birthday gift to somebody, maybe like an elderly person. And in fact, the shape and also the character have very strong religious connotations. So the double gourd, for example, often is closely associated with religious figures, especially Taoist immortals. And you can see in this painting on your right, where this Taoist immortal is actually holding a gourd. And when this same motif traveled to other parts of Asia, like in Japan, it's also closely associated with monks drinking from a gourd. And so this object is actually very common. And in the middle, I'm just trying to show you different kinds of objects that you can see in the local collection. So the one in white and the middle, it's in the LACMA collection. So pretty much the same shape. Patterns, there's certain similarities. There's a lot of furrows and scroll patterns, but not that longevity character on the PAM base. Now, since I showed you the white glazed porcelain, so it's my time for me to switch over to something slightly different. And so when we think about Chinese ceramics, blue and white certainly would be something would first come to mind. But one of my favorites are the white porcelain. I think the white, it's just very special. And a lot of them turn out to be made as anthropomorphic sculptures. Like what you see on the screen. And they are called the Hua ware or Blanc de Chine. And it's a very well-known favorites among collectors of ceramics. And they came from a slightly different region in China. So the blue and white ware is associated with Jingdezhen, the capital of porcelains in the world. They produce like 1 million pieces a day today. And even back then, this is really in high quantity that travel all over the world. Now, the Hua were slightly different because they're from Fujian along the coast. And they really took advantage of this very beautiful white color and turned it into a perfect medium for figure sculptures. So the work I'm showing you here, it's actually in the Palace Museum, depicting a famous figure in Buddhism, Bodhidharma. And it's actually a sculpture made with the sculptor's name in the seal. So it's actually a very unusual piece. And you can see that the technical virtuosity in the work, it's just really high. You look at the waves and then also the drapery of Bodhidharma. Now, in the PAM collection, we do actually have quite a number of these white glazed porcelain figures. And I believe both are featured, or at least one in the new gallery. So on your left, there's a Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, known in Chinese, Guanyin. And it's a very common figure made in white, porcelain like this. And usually a seated, almost feminized appearance. And then on your right, it's a Taoist figure, simply titled Taoist Immortal. And so there are actually quite a lot of these immortals flying around, and you can kind of guess the connection to longevity and possibly as a birthday gift to somebody. So in addition to porcelain, ceramics, same motifs or subject matter also appear in other medium. And that's actually a very common phenomenon in Chinese art. Same thing in different medium. And so in the PAM collection, we also have jade made in the shape of guanyin, but it's a very different technique because With jade, you're talking about carving and a reductive technique, whereas with ceramics, it's an additive process. You do it with clay, and so it's a completely different process. And yet the result, the motifs is the same, but it's I think for people who look at these objects and pay attention to them, they really appreciate the craftsmanship that goes into it. And for ceramic collectors, they look for particular things. For jade collectors, they look for other things. And so it's actually quite fortunate for us that we have several of these with same motifs, and that are in the PAM collection. Okay, as we move a bit further along, but almost done. And in addition to ceramics, there are actually quite a good size number of textiles in the PAM collection. And many of them date to the 19th century, and a lot of them associated with the imperial court, like this imperial robe on your left that the museum purchased. And then there are actually quite a number of women's robes that are in the collection and will be featured in the new gallery. And I also like to call attention, I don't think this, I'm not entirely sure, but I think there are actually a bunch of slippers, very nice silk slippers that feature in the current show, 2021 Intervention, First Perspective After 50 Years. And it's a really great piece by Antonius Buoy, who's very perceptive of the Chinese, to say, Asian custom of, putting on slippers once you enter a home. And so pretty fine furniture from the Ming period. I think those are highly desirable objects. And they're actually collector's items in the 20th century because a lot of the modernist furniture makers imitated the Ming style furniture for its understated style and just the beauty of the wood itself. And so Pam has a number of these chairs and also cabinets. And so, so it's, it has quite a lot of objects. Now, for people like me who study religious art, I like to look at things that are sort of bordering on the ethnographic materials. So I'm very grateful to Rebecca Hall for introducing me to this print, that actually it's in Mount Ermei in Southwest China. And this is a woodblock print from probably the 19th century, and it's pretty common during that time for people to go around and do religious pilgrimages. And when you arrive at the site, it's not a pretty common practice to buy one of these. And so, and what I'm showing you here is a different mountain. It's called Mount Wutai, but a very similar type of pilgrim's map. And if you go back to the one in Pam, so one can follow the routes all the way up from the bottom of the hill or from the mountain all the way to the top. And for people who travel to these sacred mountains in China, they're expecting some sort of encounters with the deities. And so, so it's very critical for them to know where to look for them. And so these maps provide this kind of function. Now, so I'm showing you quite a lot of these things, and I think in the interest of time, so I would just make a few concluding remarks, some of the key takeaways when we look at the Chinese art collection of PAM. So as you can see throughout this, the formation of this collection, PAM is really a community museum since its inception. Its history presents a snapshot of how the US-China relations took place or took shape on the ground in Southern California in the past 50 years. There was an initial engagement, people traveling China, and then people from China were starting moving, visiting or migrating to the US. And then there's increased trade and contact. And then eventually objects resulting from these encounters resulted in museum collections. And they actually reflect the diversity of the surrounding community. So Asians and Asian Americans who live in Southern California began to join the PAM community in growing numbers over the decades. So it's clearly manifested in the brand new Chinese Art Gallery being funded by a Asian American in the area. The US-China relations are complex and dynamic. The engagement comes with both the good and the bad, just like any form of significant cultural exchange. So on the good side, more people in the US began to see China not as an enemy to fear, but rather as a people who share common interests. In Chinese art and culture, they saw a distinctive alternative to Western tradition, something that challenged you to think big and outside the box. And on the bad side, there was scapegoating, exoticization, stereotyping, all the things that still contribute to anti-Asian hate today. So as an embodiment of this dynamic engagement through assemblage of objects, the Chinese collection at PAM is a really invaluable resource for learning, reflection, and inspiration. Now, as part of the USC community, the PAM collection is really vital for teaching and research. The museum is really a laboratory for exploring new ideas and perspectives. In order to realize its full potential, it's really important for us to preserve this collection in its totality with the understanding of its history. So what I mean by this is that we don't just focus on masterpieces, but we also want to look closely at things that look Orientalist. And we certainly do not want to get rid of any of these. And so, as you know, collection history really tells you stories about people and meanings that they attribute, that they inscribe to those objects. And those meanings change over time. So that's why it's really great to have a collection like this. And so in closing, I just want to thank you again for joining me. And now I will switch over to the show and tell. And please type your comments and questions in the chat or the Q&A box. I don't know which one you get. And I look forward to seeing you in the new Chinese Art Gallery. So now we're moving to the second part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Lee. For those that are signed on as attendees, just give us a few minutes to transition to the iPad so we can show you our objects close up. Thank you.
Okay, so we begin. All right, so the object you're looking at now is the pilgrim's map of Mount Ermey, and I believe you are getting the overview. And if you could zoom in at the bottom, that's really where you see where the viewer will enter into the mountain in the visually. And then as you can see throughout, there's actually a lot of different paths indicated in the map. And if you really follow them, we don't have time, but you can see that it really goes up all the way. And along these paths are different landmarks that one expects to find. And then you can see that in some part of the mountain, there's only one way up, but there in other parts, there actually, you get to choose, there's like a crossroads and you get to choose which one to go. And the whole point of going to these sacred mountains is actually going to the very top. And that's where usually some of the most well-known landmarks are located. And then I think really interesting is to the left here. And that's really, according to the inscription, it shows you that supposedly the Bodhisattvas of Mantabhadra actually will appear at the right time. But of course, you never know. And so that's actually a really interesting map. And some of you might notice that there's a big giant seal at the very top. That's actually, it's very common during that time for religious institutions to get their imperial approval, and usually they get a stamp, a giant chalk, and then they put it on things produced for the visitors. And so that has one of these. Now let's move on to the two Zhang Daichen lithograph we have. And on the screen, I believe you're looking at the gibbon, the monkey. And it's actually a favorite subject for Zhang because his original name is Zhang Yuan, and he likes to play it with the character for monkey, which also pronounced Yuan. And so it ended up being one of the favorite subjects. So you see a lot of monkeys in Zhang Daichen's work. And if you zoom in more closely, you see that this is not a painting, but a lithograph. So that means that you don't really see individual brushwork, although they did a pretty good job of capturing quite a bit of that. Here, you see the ink wash, a little bit of that here. And then I think it becomes a bit more apparent that this is a print, not a painting. It's when you look at the overlapping of different color blocks here, like this. They have a pretty good job. If you don't look closely, you probably miss it. Now let's turn to the other one. So there are 6 in the set that he made for Edition Press. So the first set really sold out very quickly. They're all landscape. That's sort of the background that I made for my landing page in my PowerPoint, but we didn't have that out. But this is from the second set, which has 6 lithograph. And this one, it shows you the so-called cinnabar lotus. So for many of you who know a little bit about that, and John actually made it quite clear in the inscription that they make a clear reference to the connection to Buddhism in this. But for him, since in his late age he has eyesight problem, and so he got into experimenting with ink washes, these really big blocks of color and washes, and so this in some way captures that late style of Zhang. And so if you could zoom in here, so this is a very unusual signature. So you sign it in English, Da Qian, right? So before that, they signed everything in Chinese, so it's an English signature, so it's very unusual. And then for those of you interested in Zhang's seals, there are actually quite a number of those in this one. So here's one, and then there's another one. And then the third one is in the upper left-hand corner. Okay, so now let's turn to the coursing room. So we are walking around the table, and you see that the course is up, but the room is down for safety reasons. And so you can see that this is actually, if I just show my hand, you can see this is actually a very large size. So almost half It's like 1.5 feet tall for the horse. And then if you show me here, I give you a sense of scale because I'm standing right next to it. And so this is what we call the 3-color or santai glaze. So this glaze is actually very specific to funerary purposes. That's only ceramics made for tombs during the Tang Dynasty. Pretty much from the second half of the 7th century onward, we'll have this glaze. So 3 colors, so you have the brown, you have the green, and supposed to get a bit of yellow, but not quite apparent here. And so one thing to keep in mind is that they don't put the glaze on every part because some part of it's left unglazed and only have some paint on. Whereas this glaze, once you put it on, it has this very shiny sheen to it. And it really makes you wonder, there's really no practical reason to apply this glaze. If they want to protect the whole thing, they would cover the whole thing with the glaze, but they did not. And so people really wonder about, maybe it's just like the glaze associated with certain status. Only certain people were allowed to have objects made with this glaze on. And if you now turn to the horse, I think the horse is very interesting for very many reasons. And some of you might notice immediately that the horse has hair. So the hair is not original. And according to the museum records, apparently the dealer added the horse hair before it was sold. And if you could go down, and I think this is the part that you normally don't see, it's actually hollow. There, you can see there's a hole here, right? Okay, thank you. So it's not as heavy as you might think if it's all solid. So you can see a little bit of the inside, and then the plinth that you see here is also relatively pretty made, but actually made just stable enough to allow the horse to stand. Now, if you look at the groom, for example, I believe the whole thing is made of solid, and you can see there's really no opening. We should turn to the groom. Right, so this is a lot heavier, considering its size. Even the horse is bigger, so it might not be as, but the same weight. Now, some of you may be wondering, what's so special about horse and groom? And if we look more closely at the groom's face or his appearance, you can see that this is a foreigner. And there are certain characteristics associated with people coming from Central Asia. So you have this kind of cone-shaped head, large nose, big eyes, and there's a big beard usually. And then, deep set eyes, the facial features that you don't normally associate with Chinese people. And so, and it's actually it's made very clear to the maker, to the viewer, that this is a foreign groom, presumably someone who came with the horse. So all this point to the understanding that this is a very expensive horse coming from Central Asia. He also came with its groom, or I guess nowadays it's a shower. And so, these tomb figurines actually give you a really nice window into the lives of those who value these objects back in the Tang Dynasty. And I believe we are about 10 minutes left. And so I'd be happy to go back and answer some questions. So thank you so much for helping with the showing down. So let me go back to PowerPoint. Can you all hear me? Oh, Christina needs to hide in order to get rid of the echo. Okay. Now, I'd be happy to answer questions from the audience. So let me see.
To our attendees, feel free to type in your questions in the chat box feature, and Dr. Lee will address those.
see. I don't see any.
Could I just raise my hand to ask a question?
Sure, you can address Dr. Lee Nancy directly. I recognize the voice. Thank you.
Thank you. Throughout
Oh,
your
okay. So I guess you have to.
So she's gonna, I guess she just wants to address you directly, Dr. Lee. So this is one of our docents, Nancy. Nancy, go ahead with your question.
Thank you. Throughout your research on the collection, do you find we have a good record about the donors' background, particularly Snowcone? You know, he donated so many ceramics objects to the museum. I couldn't find his background and why he particularly interested in ceramics only.
Which donor you're talking about?
Snowcone.
Oh, Snowcone. From what I have heard was that he's a local businessman, and he donated a large group of objects to PAM in a short notice. And so there's not a whole lot of paper trail from that. And I believe it's made when David Kaminsky was director. And during that time, the record keeping wasn't very strong. And so we don't really have that many
information
documents
about
related to the, yeah, fortunately. But we do have a lot of his objects. And,
yes,
and I believe curators throughout the years have asked for expert opinions and done tests on some of these objects. So some of them look very good. Some of them I don't know, because these objects can be very tricky to look at, because some of them are low fire, can be easily made. And so the way to date ceramics is to use a thermoluminescent test. It can be a very expensive test. So if it's a particular piece you really want to find out, then of course you need to send it off to get it tested. But you're talking about a couple hundred pieces, so I think it will take time. And I think the next best thing we can do is to identify, maybe some of them have very close. You look at exhibition, archaeological reports or exhibition catalogs featuring these objects, you can kind of see maybe it could be from the same tomb, or it could be made later. So we can make all kinds of educated guesses, and then we explain that to the audience.
The other question I have is my impression that the collection of Chinese scroll painting in the museum is pretty limited. Am I correct to say that?
Yes, actually I prepared one to show, but I don't know we have time. That's actually a Southern Moore attributed to him. And Southern Moore is actually a well-known painter from the late Yuan period. And so that's a very famous painting in the LACMA collection, Invitation to the Recluse. And so I did a little comparison, but in general, scroll paintings are not a strong part of the collection, and because it's due to the donor's interest.
Of course.
And so if you look at the collection at the Met or at even LACMA, I mean, the objects that came in reflects the interest, the collecting interest of these donors. And some of them were purchased by museums, but it's just, but the PAM museum purchases are relatively limited, but there are a few.
Thank you, Nancy, for that question. It looks like we have time for maybe one more question. If you would like to type that into the chat box, that would be wonderful. But I guess this looks like it's, we can conclude our program. I don't see any more questions.
I think I see this very long question about.
Okay.
Do you see it?
I do not, but if you see it, please go ahead and.
There's also somebody raising their hand,
Oh, okay.
Madame Lowe.
You know, I don't know how to put into the check box, but I have a questions about, because I'm very, very partial to the Tang Dynasty. You know, especially the fat lady, because Tang Dynasty is the most successful or prosperous of the dynasties in the Chinese history. And I'm very partial to the fat lady, you know, with the hair and then all that. Are there many figurines in the collection?
There are actually quite a number of them. I have to say, I have not seen as many, and I believe in the newly renovated Silk Road Gallery, there are actually a few of them being put on display. And in the new Chinese gallery, which will open in about a week, I believe there are a few others. So, but there are hundreds of them in the collection. And I have to say, I only saw a few, like the Horseman Room. So yeah, I think it's just really fascinating to look at these figurines. I think that they're very lively and very revealing of the cultural interests of the time.
I want to thank you so much for the lecture. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. And Amy, you have a question? You have a raised hand?
Yeah, I put it in the chat, but it seems like it's not that visible. So I'm not sure if your chat's actually working. But I'm really interested in this horse and the addition of the hair. And I wanted to ask you if that is a convention, something that dealers did. Was this something that was a normal practice at the time? Or was this something really intended for, you know, Western collectors in particular?
I think the addition of hair, definitely. And I asked the staff, they think it's synthetic material. It's not real hair, okay? And I believe some of these tomb figurines have ceramic hair in the sense that they actually made, you know, the mane into part of it. But this one did not. So maybe it makes you wonder, maybe in the original form, they put some other material, just that over time, you know, over that, you know, 1,000 years, they disappeared. And so, you know, to make them more appealing, selling these things, dealers certainly will do things. And the horse, you can see there are a lot of cracks and being put back together. So the groom, the standing figure seems to be fairly intact, except just like hands missing. But yeah, there's actually a lot of work being done before, and I believe it's not done at a museum. And it's probably done when it was still in the dealer's shop. Okay, and I think this question from seeing very clearly. How do they get interested in these particular collections, obtaining them for what resources? Okay, so there's a question about the collection history, about the donors, how they got interested in these particular collections. A lot of these objects came in during the time of David Kaminsky, who was director from 1977 to 2005, I believe. So he was a longtime director, and he himself was a collector. So he brought the Choi paintings and others. And so along the way, he was actually quite ahead of his time. That he saw things that no one was collecting or put on exhibitions about, and he did that. So he did a show on Tibetan furniture. No one, you know, even cared about Tibetan furniture at the time. And then he also collected contemporary Chinese art that was not on people's radar. And so he did quite a lot of really adventurous things. And he collected not only in China, but in other areas. So it's also closely linked to the market dynamics. So a lot of the people who donated to PAM are not like big collectors with lots of resources. So I think that's why it makes it very interesting, because for the middle class or the upper middle class, what people could afford and actually enjoy having these kind of objects at home, and eventually we're willing to donate to a local museum. So yeah, I think a lot of work needs to be done. And I didn't talk as much about the earlier history of PAM, the prehistory, because that's also closely linked to the question, you know, why, you know, all of a sudden there's a Pacific Asia Museum, because it didn't come out of the blue. In fact, there was a germinating process leading to it.
Mhm.
Well, I think we're at time. But I just want to take this moment to thank Dr. Sonya Lee for leading such an interesting conversation. I learned quite a lot today, so thank you so much for taking time to drive all the way out to Pam. But to our guests, thank you for attending and supporting our programs, and we hope to see you soon. On a high note, we are reopening our Chinese gallery soon, so please keep an eye out on our website for more information. And I hope that everyone has a good holiday season and stay healthy. And thank you again. I hope everyone takes care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
You.